I'm Professor Kenneth Hansen of the University of Central Florida Judaic Studies program, and I'd like to share some exciting new backstories gleaned from the Hebrew Bible with a little help from AI. When most people think of biblical prophecy, their first association is with apocalyptic speculations regarding the end of days, as well as messianic messages of future hope and supernatural deliverance. What many don't recognize is the tension that existed between a group of marginalized priests whose roots went back to ancient Shiloh and the theocratic rulers of Jerusalem who rebuilt the temple in 515 BCE after their long exile in Babylon. These hierocrats, as we can call them, had no use for apocalypticism, focusing instead on the here and now. And this new second temple, it was the loyal opposition, let's call them the visionaries, who cultivated the end-time prophecies of divine intervention into the present world order. Their prophecies of a new Jerusalem would resonate across the millennia and captivate people of faith down to the present day. We'll need to engage in a good deal of textual analysis and reading between the lines in what amounts to biblical detective work, and we just may need some help from a couple of famous detectives and an archaeologist adventurer you just might recognize. That said, let's dive in and consider the literary origins of this ancient class of visionaries. Let's recap. The priestly descendants of Moses, the Mushites, exiled under King Solomon, didn't just fade away. They stuck around, even being welcomed back to Jerusalem and the temple precincts by the good King Josiah, whose Mushite high priest Hilkiah found the book of the law in the holy house. When the ruling Aaronide Zadokite priests were sent into Babylonian captivity, the Mushites, who were absorbed among the Levites, remained, tending to religious affairs. Upon the return of the Zadokites, following their 70-year exile, fresh tension erupted as they reasserted authority and pushed aside the Mushites, who should now be considered disenfranchised Levites. As they seek to win popular support by cultivating spirituality and focusing on the end of days, we can also call them the visionaries.
As for their literary roots, the visionaries grew out of prophetic, especially Deuteronomic traditions. They drew on the archaic divine warrior concept to explain how the final judgment and restoration would come to pass. It would involve a new conquest of the land. The apocalyptic eschatology they created was not, contrary to much scholarly opinion, a Persian import. Rather, there was a direct trajectory from prophecy to apocalypticism. It might be called an inner Israelite social matrix. It reutilized Canaanite mythopoetic language. This reuse of myth was in tension with the restored community's leadership.
In general, the visionaries appear to have been the disciples of the prophet identified as second Isaiah, who is understood by most scholars to have been a disciple, or group of disciples, of the original prophet. Written decades later, immediately after the return of the ruling class from exile, this second section of the book of Isaiah begins with chapter 40 and extends until chapter 55.
Textual sleuths have theorized that the polemic of the visionary Democrats against the ruling hierocrats is now found in so-called third Isaiah, chapters 55 through 66, which is largely an attack on the leading exilic priestly party. Chapters 60 through 62 of the book of Isaiah amounted to a rival restoration plan, proclaiming that all the people, not only the Zadokites, should be priests. Ve'amech kulam tzadikim, leolam yirshu aretz, netzer mata'ai ma'aseh yadai lehitpa'er. Your people shall all be righteous. They shall inherit the land forever, the branch of my planting, the work of my hands, in which I glory. Ve'atem kohanei Hashem tikareu, משרתי אלוהינו יאמר לכם, חיל גויים תאכלו, ובכבודם תתיימרו. But you shall be named the priests of the Lord. Men shall call you the ministers of our God. You shall eat the wealth of the nations, and in their splendor shall you revel. A similar message is echoed in the latter section of Zechariah, chapters 9 to 14, written by the visionaries, but attached to the first 8 chapters, which were the product of the opposing Zadokite hierocrats. That, at least, is the theory. In these passages, we clearly see the evolution from prophetic eschatology to apocalyptic eschatology. Here, the domain of divine action is no longer that of history, but is rather entirely in the cosmic realm. This is because the visionaries' hope of vindication in the present age faded, leaving only an aspiration for divine, supernatural intervention. On some level, they might even be considered escapists. The Zadokite hierocrats, by contrast, believed in what we might call a realized eschatology, that is, in the here and now. And they even identified Zerubbabel, the governor of Judea under whom the rebuilding of the temple at Jerusalem took place, with the Messiah. We read in the book of Haggai 2:23, Bayom hahu neum Hashem tzvaot, ekachecha Zerubbabel, ben Shealtiel avdi neum Hashem, v'samticha kechotam, ki vacha bacharti neum Hashem tzvaot. In that day, says the Lord of hosts, I will take you, O Zerubbabel, my servant, the son of Shealtiel, says the Lord, and will make you as a signet, for I have chosen you, says the Lord of hosts.
The hierocrats were generally indifferent toward eschatology. They identified the temple with the New Jerusalem and the Zadokite priesthood with end-time rulers. They viewed the temple and priesthood, even though supported by foreign alliance, as eternal, absolute, and immune to judgment. The hierocratic priesthood had 2 post-exilic prophets in their camp, one being Haggai and the other Zechariah, as represented in the first 8 chapters of the book. This material may even be seen as a direct polemic against the visionary movement, who were challenging them.
Well said, Sherlock. Zechariah 3:1-10, for example, declares the high priest Joshua and his colleagues to be the legitimate priests. ויראני את יהושע, הכהן הגדול, עומד לפני מלאך השם, והשטן עומד על ימינו, לשטנו. ויאמר השם אל השטן, יגער השם בך השטן, ויגער השם בך הבוחר בירושלים. הלא זה אוד מוצל מאש, שמע נא יהושע, הכהן הגדול, אתה ורעך, היושבים לפניך, כי אנשי מופת המה, כי הנני מביא את עבדי צמח. And he showed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right hand to accuse him. And the Lord said to Satan, The Lord rebuke you, O Satan. Yes, the Lord who has chosen Jerusalem rebuke you. Is not this man a brand plucked out of the fire? Hear now, O Joshua the high priest, you and your fellows who sit before you, for they are men who are a sign. For behold, I will bring forth my servant the shoot, the branch.
The opposition of the visionaries was trifold, so we deduce. They stood against the Persian-sponsored temple, they opposed the civic and spiritual leaders of the hierocratic party, and they rejected the lack of focus on the end of days by the post-exilic Israelite orthodoxy. They combined old traditions of ritual conquest and ritual procession as they borrowed mythic, divine warrior motifs.
Again, Sherlock, you have nailed it. The visionaries lambasted the Israelite nobles and religious leaders in the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Malachi for straying from the way of holiness and for seeking pleasure and gain. They insisted that the fulfillment of Israel's history remained in the future. The end would come only after the present structures, institutionalized by the hierocrats, had been destroyed and replaced by a new order. In a larger sense, we can draw some serious insight from all this, namely that there is a brooding minority experiencing deprivation behind every apocalyptic movement. In this case, the Mushite Levites were essentially disenfranchised by upper-class Zadokite Aaronides returning to Judea from Babylonian exile. The hierocracy they formed was supported by the Persians, inspiring Zechariah as well as Ezekiel 40 through 48, Haggai, and Chronicles. The minority visionaries mounted an opposition, and the people as a whole were drawn to their literary product, at least until Zechariah and Haggai appealed for popular legitimization of the hierocrats' agenda.
With some deductive reasoning, we can speculate that the anti-establishment visionaries became the spiritual forerunners of the so-called pious ones, the Hasidim of the Maccabean revolt and beyond. In their own way, they preserved the prophetic spirit. They organized anti-establishment conventicles, that is, secret groups meeting for religious purposes. They produced the so-called Little Apocalypse of Isaiah 24 through 27, sandwiched into the book by later editors. They also produced Zechariah 12 through 14, and Joel.
These Hasidim are briefly mentioned in 1st and 2nd Maccabees, and some argue that it was the Hasidim who produced the book of Daniel as well as 1st Enoch. We should note, however, that this might be a stretch, and the so-called mighty warriors referenced in 1st Maccabees 2:42 may well not have been the authors of Daniel, which takes a quietist, non-committal approach to the Maccabean revolt itself. In the final analysis, we can understand apocalyptic literature as stemming from a deep sense of alienation and deprivation. The visionaries who produced it felt seriously marginalized by the ruling elites, and on that level they share much in common with modern counterculture movements. Moreover, the current that propelled them may well have given rise to a number of other sectarian groups in the Second Temple period. The Essenes, normally associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls, may in fact have been a marginalized umbrella group, which spawned the Dead Sea sect as a separate subgroup. Within the Essene umbrella group may also have been the so-called Enochians, who espoused the eschatology represented in the books of Enoch, and the Therapeutae, who cultivated the arts of divine healing. Then there was a new messianic movement, the Jesus movement, which shared many of the concepts of apocalyptic eschatology. While it developed into a distinctly non-Jewish religion, this, ironically, was the enduring legacy of Israel's ancient visionaries, and the serious scholarly endeavor of understanding how these currents grew and developed has only just begun.